Is the Director of Policy at the Counter-Extremism Group, Tom Wilson. Tom, thank you very much indeed. As Mark White was just explaining, the War Cabinet in Israel are meeting. They'll be deciding what to do. What do you suspect they will decide?
Well, it's impossible to know, and it may be that Israel simply decides to carry out another series of attacks targeting Iranian proxies or the IRGC and their infrastructure in places like Syria. Or it could be that they decide that since there's been a direct attack on Israeli territory, they will directly attack Iranian territory. I think for the Israelis, what they're going to be thinking about is how to establish and maintain deterrent to Iran, because although there has been conversations here about not escalating, I think Israel is very aware that ever since October the 7th, Iran has been escalating, because it's ultimately inconceivable that something like October the 7th and that massacre could have happened without Iranian support. And what we've seen from Western policy is an attempt for a number of years now, going back to Barack Obama's time as president, is attempts to essentially negotiate with, appease, moderate the Iranian regime have now failed. And so a policy of deterrent, of making Iran understand there's a very high cost to doing things like what they did the other evening, may be the best way that Israel can push back against the Iranian threat.
Of course, the attack was a failure. There were 99% of those 331 missiles and drones were downed by coalition forces, mainly Israel, but of course the Americans, the Brits, the Jordanians, the Saudis as well. Of course, the message from the United States, from the G7, from the UK is restraint, is one of restraint towards Israel. Frankly, the escalation here to state-on-state warfare would be incredibly destabilizing for the whole world. What is the most restrained action that Israel could do that would also satisfy their legitimate need to retaliate?
I mean, they could carry out strikes against Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, as they already have been doing, but that wouldn't stop the conflict from continuing. It's very clear that for years now, Iran has sought confrontation not only with Israel, but also with the US. And don't forget that US installations and US consulates in the Middle East have been targeted by Iran and its proxies. And I think, it's significant that Britain took part in the action over the weekend to try and repel the Iranian attacks, because of the fact that we have also suffered at the hands of Iran. It's British troops who were being killed in Iraq and Afghanistan by Iranian-made roadside bombs. Our embassy in Tehran was stormed by the Iranians some years ago. And we also, of course, have pro-Iranian extremist groups operating here in the UK. We had, of course, the Al-Quds Day march in London only the other week, where Hezbollah flags are usually seen flying. They weren't flying this time because Hezbollah is now proscribed, but I don't think that's because everybody on the march has suddenly stopped supporting Hezbollah.
Well, Tom, it's interesting you mentioned that was going to be my next question. What are the implications on our domestic security? How will Iran be seeking to behave? Will they be funding terrorist activities in this country? I know that Israel are calling on the UK government to prescribe the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps here as a terrorist organisation. What are the implications for the average Brit's safety?
Well, so far, Iran has obviously been very careful not to target the British public, but for Iranian dissidents who live here in Britain, I think that this must be a very frightening time, because there are a series of organizations and networks that are completely aligned with the Iranian regime. The degree to which they're being directed by the IRGC, we can't know. But nevertheless, the general atmosphere of extremism, of incitement, of support for terrorism, at least ideologically, is encouraged by many of these different groups. And in the UK, we need to be far more mindful of how a regime that is fundamentally hostile to the West, to Western democracy, and to Britain, how we are acting to make sure that they don't continue to incite and have a divisive influence on the situation between communities here in the UK. And that should be the first thing that we're trying to do. As you mentioned, prescribing the IRGC would be one very obvious way to do that. But I also think that taking measures to disrupt various extremist Islamist groups backed by Iran in the UK would also be an important policy for the UK to pursue.
Well, we are, of course, expecting a statement from the Prime Minister in the House of Commons a little bit later this afternoon, which may well go as far as prescribing the IRGC and perhaps even more sanctions. It's hard to imagine what more sanctions we can place upon Iran at this stage. But Tom Wilson, Director of Policy at the Counter-Extremism Group, really appreciate your time. Thank you.